Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Before I begin this presentation, I would like to acknowledge that in Mapuche territory, in Mapu, what today is known as southern Chile, the Pilmanquen River is being transformed to feed yet another hydroelectric power plant by Norwegian company Statkraft. Also in Mapu, also known as southern Argentina, the local government wants to use the waters of the Carranleufu River to generate power for the mining companies. Both rivers are being defended by Mapuche communities led by women. And now I'm going to share some slides to support my presentation. My presentation is entitled Of Moss and Flowers, Scientific Poetics and Anti-Colonial Micropolitics in the works of Mapuche poets Leonel Lienlaf and Cristian Antillanca. Since the emergence of the natural sciences in the mid-18th century in Europe, the modern scientific method has been used as an indisputable, universal and neutral certificate of authority to exercise colonial violence on indigenous bodies and territories. Throughout Turtle Island and Abya Yala, settled colonialism, in its thirst for land and its riches, undertakes ongoing genocidal practices that entail environmental detriment. As Dina Gilio-Whittaker puts it, settled colonialism itself is for indigenous peoples a structure of environmental injustice. Moreover, Mapuche leader and Huichafe or fighter Moira Millán and the Movimiento de Mujeres Indígenas por el Buen Vivir used the term terricide to name the systematic extermination of the land, la tierra, and all of its life forms by settled colonial states and corporations. Thus, I rename modern science that has been to this day at the service of settled colonial nations and corporations as terricidal science, because it has provided the tools, methodologies, and rhetorical discourses that justify the invasion of indigenous territories, the theft of indigenous knowledges, and the conversion of multiple and diverse, including human lives, diverse lives, into exploitable private property. Taking into consideration the intricacies of hegemonic modern science and settled colonialism, I read the book of poems Kogen by Leonel Lienlaf and the book of poems and photographs Wanglen y el Canto de las Flores by Cristian Antillanca as Mapuche scientific poetics. I ask, what can these works say about science, what practices of terricidal science, and what Mapuche scientific knowledges underlie them? I find that these Mapuche poetics from the Huililafque Mapu, that is the southern and coastal lands of the Mapuche historical territory, allude to aspects of Mapuche knowledge which allow for the regeneration of life on Mapuche land. These scientific poetics contain micropolitics against terricide and for the caring weaving of life. The poems show the co-creation of Mapuche science. On one hand, Kogen by Lienlaf presents what I have named a pedagogy of the moss that disproves the scientific myth of the inevitable disappearance of the Mapuche people. And on the other hand, Wanglen y el Canto de las Flores by Antillanca shows a stellar genealogy of all the lives of the Mapu, the land, that puts forward a Mapuche self-representation against the grain of terricidal science appropriations. By reading both works as scientific poetics, I intend to contribute to the recognition of the fact that indigenous peoples are not without science, as terricidal agents often claim. On the contrary, Mapuche knowledge of the Mapu, the land, from the ground up to the sky, constitutes scientific thought and praxis. The science that fuels the creativity of Lienlaf and Antillanca comes from the interaction that the authors, their families, and larger communities of the territories have established over time with the Mapu, the land. In an interview, Lienlaf affirms that the word Kogen refers to a moss that comes out in one of the springs where his family draws water. Lienlaf and his family have lived for generations in Alepo, a coastal town in the province of Valdivia. For its part, Antillanca's book Wanglen y el Canto de las Flores contains pictures of flowers that grow in different but nearby places of the Huillilaftque map, the mountain range of Purranque, the city of Osorno, and the coastal towns of Pucatriwe and Chaiwin. These places correspond to the daily routes of Antillanca between work, leisure, and family life. Thus, Antillanca and Lienlaf's scientific poetry is rooted in their experiences as members of specific territories and communities where different human and non-human bodies interact and co-create the knowledge necessary for a healthy cohabitation. Now let's go to Kogen by Lienlaf. I read Leonel Lienlaf's poetry book, Kogen, as a scientific poetic that maps a pedagogy of the moss at the Huilliche-Lafkenche territory of Alepo. This plant pedagogy grows from the relations of care among diverse bodies of the Mapu and uproots the myth of the inevitable extinction of the Mapuche nation. This terricidal myth is a political invention that perversely hides colonial violence against indigenous people and functions as a moral and scientific justification for the plundering of lands, slavery, epistemicide, ecocide, and feminicide. The poem Boceto para una cartografía en verde opaco y barro, as in the majority of the poems of the book, the title evokes a scientific imaginary. Lienlaf's poetic language, modded with knowledge, contains a heteroglossia that allows for the analysis of the pedagogy of the moss, as well as cartography as a tool for terricidal science. The speaker of the poem, which could be human or non-human, embodies a kimche, a sage person who describes the process of knowing in this way. No es este el relato de mundos ya idos, ya olvidados, ya ocultos en años. Es un viaje por varias tierras, suelos, sendero oscuro claros, que se abren misteriosos ante tus ojos, como brisa, como viento, como nubes. Ahí está el secreto, en la piedra que pisas cada día en los caminos, en los musgos, en las plantas, en el viento. No busques entonces los augurios fáciles porque no hay destino, solo ráfagas de viento entre las ramas. The Mapu, the land, corresponds to the sustaining space of all knowledge that must be wandered so that the transfer of information between different lives becomes possible. The verses show the rhythm of a scientific poetic methodology that unfolds in a procedural way, anchored in the daily life of earthly phenomena. Lienlaf's poems are written in the codes of a knowledge that only occurs inside and through caring relationships between non-human and human lives, similar to Lian Betasamosake Simpson's notion of the land as pedagogy in the Anishinaabe context. According to Simpson, knowledge depends on a balanced relationship of mutuality among all lives. Learning for Lienlaf and for Simpson entails a spiritual and political process aiming for indigenous autonomy and self-determination. Learning from the Mapu implies paying attention to the multitudes of the land without putting lives on a scale of biological and moral assessment. The poetic science in Kogen is the opposite of the speciesism of the terricidal Western thought, present even before modern science, that lead evolutionary scientists on the 19th century to state that the native inhabitants of the European colonies were semi-human compared to Caucasian men. In Kogen's verses, no lives are more suitable than others to house knowledge. In this sense, Lienlaf's pedagogy of the moss practices a micropolitic of indigenous justice, as understood by Gilio Whittaker, by restoring balance in relationships that are out of balance. Going back to the poem's title, Boceto para una cartografía en verde opaco y barro, and to the first verse, ¿No es este el relato de mundos ya idos, ya olvidados, ya ocultos en años? The word cartography and the idea of worlds being erased indicate a history of colonial invasion and refers to the scientific myth of the vanishing Indian. After the invasion of the Mapuche territory by the Chilean Republic in the late 19th century, barbarian Capuchin missionaries settled on the Huillilac Mapu. Their mapping and genocidal schooling contributed to what Gilio Whittaker calls environmental deprivation, the dispossession of land and resources for the destruction of indigenous lives and cultures. Therefore, the verses refuse the terricidal myth of Mapuche extinction and go on to prove it wrong by describing how co-creation of knowledge happens in the Mapuche living territory, a knowledge that constantly regenerates peoplehood in relation to land. While in Kogen, the Mapuche scientific poetic reveals a pedagogy of the moss, in Wanglen y el Canto de las Flores by Antillanca, science is present by way of a stellar genealogy that demonstrates the biological and affective relations among the stars, the flowers, and the Mapuche. Antillanca composes a scientific poetic treatise based on ancient Mapuche stories that allow him to exercise a Mapuche self-representation which defies terricidal science appropriations. The book Wanglen y el Canto de las Flores invites the readers to embark on an outer space journey through Mapuche, Huilliche, Lafkenche knowledge. Antillanca focuses his lens on ancient stories told by his people that suggest kinship bonds among diverse lives. Aquí principia este canto, aquí principia esta voz, en los grandes y pequeños ríos del cielo que viajan por la materia oscura, inventando todos los colores. Escucha pues lo que dicen del amor, siente cómo te arma y te destroza los ojos, escucha la música de las esferas celestiales naciendo de la maternidad del universo, oye cómo lloran los pequeños planetas, cómo tiemblan las estrellas que nacen al oscuro del día estelar que amanece entre nebulosas. The poetic voice situates the beginning of the universe in the sky, the Wenumapu or land of the above. The rivers of the sky in Mapuche astronomy, according to Margarita Canillo and Gabriel Pozo, include what Western science calls galaxies and star-forming nebulae. From the contrast between these rivers and dark matter, colors are born. Down on the surface of planet Earth, the flowers embody these vibrant and diverse cosmic colors. The poetic voice invites the readers or listeners to be touched by the story they are telling. Depicting the universe as maternal suggests a larger matter-diverse, biodiverse, and affect-diverse family, a stellar genealogy. The poetic voice draws from an ancestral memory, a song sung by many over time. The songs of the Mapuche are sources of knowledge. Antillanca's poem is based on oral data that the Mapuche Huilliche have gathered for generations. As Robin Wall Kimmerer says about indigenous knowledge, generations of data collection and validation over time build proven theories. Thus, Antillanca's origin poem is just as scientific as the Big Bang Theory. However, terricidal science distorts indigenous knowledges and commodifies it for its consumption, adding the prefix ethno to indigenous sciences. According to Canillo and Pozo, Catholic missionaries, European anthropologists, and linguists during the 19th and the 20th century studied Mapuche words that refer to the sky, but none of them recognized their informants as scientists. The same can be said about settler botany. The indigenous knowledge of plants hardly ever was and is attributed to the people who created. Antillanca's poetry recuperates appropriated Mapuche knowledge by putting into practice a scientific methodology that consists of listening to the elders, observing the Mapu, which includes the sky, and remembering information contained in his own stellar DNA. This methodology works as a micropolitic of taking knowledge back. Hence, the flower portraits in Wanglen perform an auto-representation of what it is to be a Mapuche. The pictures of the flowers of the Huillilaftque Mapu can be thought of as a family album of the plant relatives of the Mapuche. Portraits in the Mapuche territory have a colonial history, that of stage pictures where the Mapuche were deployed as an archaic and exotic race bound to disappear. Settled photographers such as Christian Falk and Otber Heffer helped reinforce the scientific genocidal myth of the vanishing Indian and crafted what a Mapuche should look like for the settled society. Antillanca's photos instead capture the vitality of the flowers as members of the Mapuche nation and transmit a very alive Mapuche sensibility intensified by the poems. Thus, the flowerly albums resignifies the terricidal scientific discipline of botany, its plant theft and knowledge theft, which Laurelyn Witt calls biocolonialism and Vandana Shiva calls biopiracy in reference to today's appropriation of native seeds. And let's not forget that botany played an important part in the racialization of oppressed peoples. Contrary to botany books written by terricidal scientists and missionaries, the words attached to the images in Wanglen refer to life relations between the Mapuche, the plants, and the sky. Flowers are not the object of knowledge, but have knowledge. Clinging to the firmament of the land, the flowering plants sprout cyclically to sing the ancient stories of the Mapu. In conclusion, unlike terricidal science, the Mapuche science that Lienlaf and Antillanca show in their works is based on a system of knowledge that is inseparable from an ethical stance for the defense of life in all its forms. The poetic works offer processes of knowing and methodologies that act as micropolitics against terricide and terricidal science. Therefore, Mapuche scientific poetics oppose the intense modification and systematic extermination of the land, and instead contribute to the longevity of the Mapuche nation, which includes rivers, mountains, forests, animals, minerals, plants, moss, flowers, and the stars, among other lives. Thank you for listening.